Hello, everyone. Welcome back to IDST 250, the Common Good Practicum. Today, we're going to talk about libertarianism. Before we jump into today, let me remind you what's due today. Before watching this lecture, you should have read Chapter 3 of Sandel, plus a few pages of Chapter 4 and a few pages of Chapter 6. And answered the questions in your homework. And you should complete Practicum Step 2. I'm going to collect all of this. It needs to be in the folder by August 25th. That's the Tuesday coming up. So make sure it's in the folder August 25th. Make sure you get that Practicum Step 2 completed. For the next week's class, for day 7, I'm going to have you read a chapter on Kant in Sandel. This is chapter 5, and chapter 6 on Rawls. Just a little warning. Kant is one of the hardest thinkers we're going to look at in this class. I feel like utilitarianism and libertarianism is pretty easy. It's easier to understand. It's not that hard. Kant gets a little bit more difficult, so if it's starting to confuse you, don't worry. That's normal. I'm not going to require full comprehension of Kant. There'll be a few things I want you to know about Kant, and that's okay. Those of you who love philosophy, you'll gobble it up, and that's great too. Finally, what do you need for today? You need your copy of Sandel, and you need your handout number 6. On libertarianism. All right, well, let's jump in. What is libertarianism? That's the first question. I'm gonna start with a quotation from Sandel. This is from page 59. This is the final paragraph of page 59. Sandel writes, "Libertarians favor unfettered markets and oppose government regulation, not in the name of economic efficiency, but in the name of human freedom. Their central claim is that each of us has a fundamental right to liberty, the right to do whatever we want with the things we own, provided we respect other people's rights to do the same." There's 3 things I want you to know about libertarianism, and you can write these in your handout in box 1. Here they are. 1, libertarianism is a form of liberalism. It's a form of liberalism, that idea we looked at a few class periods ago. To remind you, liberalism is the idea that the individual is the most important unit of society and that the government exists to protect individual liberty. You could also throw in there liberalism, and libertarianism along with it believes that human beings have a fundamental right to liberty. A fundamental right to liberty. So number 1, libertarianism is a form of liberalism. Humans have a right to liberty. So what makes libertarianism distinct from other forms of liberalism? Well, one thing is this. Number 2, libertarianism is built on the assumption of self-ownership. The reason humans have a fundamental right to liberty is that humans own themselves. Each of us owns ourselves. Your neighbor doesn't own you. The government doesn't own you. God doesn't own you. Your children don't own you. You own yourself. That's the claim. So number 2, libertarianism is built on the assumption of self-ownership. And number 3, libertarianism supports the minimal state. So like liberalism in general, libertarianism assumes some kind of social contract where we give up certain powers, namely the powers of policing, of protecting our rights and enforcing contracts. We hand this over to a minimal state. This brings us to our second question. What is the minimal state? Well, the government has 3 jobs. Number 1, protect liberty and private property. Protect liberty, you could throw life in there too. Protect liberty, life, and property. Number 2, protect people from force, theft, and fraud, particularly in the marketplace. When we want to exchange things, we need the government to protect us from force, theft, and fraud. We want the market to be free from coercion. Finally, we want a government, number 3, to enforce contracts. Right? A society won't run, and the market won't run if people constantly go back on their word. If I agree to sell you, 10 wooden cabinets for $4,000 or something, and then I spend the next 3 weeks making them, and then I show up expecting to get paid, and you break the contract, there will be no trust. You repeat that over and over again, and nobody will trust each other. The whole market will break down. So we do need a government who will enforce contracts. And that's it. That's all the minimal state is supposed to do. Again, protect liberty, life, and private property, protect people from force, theft, and fraud, especially in the marketplace, and enforce contracts. Importantly, libertarians reject all other kinds of laws or all other kinds of government involvement in our lives. There are 3 kinds of laws that libertarians reject. And this is the third question in your handout. They reject paternalistic laws. Paternalistic laws are laws that protect people from harming themselves. Right? So this is why libertarians would be opposed to, for example, laws that force motorcyclists to wear helmets or seat belts when you drive a car. Sure, it's wise. Sure, it's smart to wear a seatbelt. Sure, it's smart to wear a helmet when you drive a motorcycle. But the government has no business pretending to be our parent. That's what the word paternalistic means. We can look after ourselves, and if we choose to be foolish, we should be allowed to be foolish with our own lives. Similarly, libertarians are usually for the legalization of drugs. Sure, drugs aren't great. They screw up our bodies in all kinds of ways. But if people want to do that to themselves, what business has the government to tell them not to? So no paternalistic laws. Another type of law that libertarians reject is moral legislation. Moral legislation are laws that promote notions of virtue or express the moral convictions of the majority. So, let's say the majority thinks all businesses should be closed on Sunday because this respects God. Libertarian would say that's a moral legislation. You're imposing the majority's view that Sunday is some kind of holy day on the rest of us. We should be free to have business and work whatever we want. So no moral legislation. Similarly, take the law against something like prostitution. Some people think prostitution is immoral. Well, fine, then don't do it yourself, but the government doesn't have a place in shutting down things that everybody thinks is immoral. Unless, of course, unless, of course, the government is protecting somebody's rights or protecting people from coercion and force and theft and things like that. Finally, in addition to rejecting paternalistic laws and moral legislation, libertarians reject wealth redistribution. This does not mean they're opposed to all taxes, because remember, they want some kind of government. They want a government that's big enough and strong enough to enforce laws and to protect rights. So, for example, you might even have a libertarian argue for a slight tax increase if it meant the right to a fair trial was strengthened. Right now, we live in a country where people without resources, people who are on the poorer end of society, don't usually get a fair trial. A libertarian, this should drive them crazy. They should say, that is insane. That is a violation of our rights. A libertarian would then say, how do we solve that problem? And let's say research suggested, well, we need to have better paid public defenders, right? So instead of having the worst lawyers be the public defenders, or the public defenders be the least paid, what if instead we paid them a really competitive rate? And then the poor would have really great representation in court. So it could be the case that a libertarian argues in one case for an increase of taxes so that a right is actually protected and defended against. That's the caveat. I just want to make sure you understand they're not totally against taxes. But beyond the minimal state, any other form of wealth redistribution is evil. Why? It's akin to slavery. Taxation is akin to slavery. Why? Well, taxation forces you to work for the government, in a sense. Let's say you're taxed at 30%. You get to keep 70% of your earnings, but you have to pay someone else, the government, 30%. They take that money from you. It's not like you can just say, oh, I'm only going to work 70% of the day, and then I'm going to stop early and cheat the government out of its 30% because I don't want to give it to them. No, in a sense, the government forces you now to work the final 30% of your day. And in a sense, you're not free then. You're in fact being forced to work. You're in a sense enslaved, and the government therefore owns you, or at least 30% of you. And this contradicts the fundamental premise of libertarianism, which is self-ownership. I own myself. The government doesn't own me. My neighbors don't own me. God doesn't own me. My children don't own me. I own myself. So those are the three kinds of laws rejected. 1, paternalistic laws. 2, moral legislation. And 3, wealth redistribution. Let's imagine a scenario that could happen then in a fully libertarian world. Imagine a fire department, a libertarian fire department. Right now, in large cities, people don't have a choice. They're forced to pay taxes which pay for the fire department. You can't opt out. You can't say, no, I want to keep my $15 a month, or I don't know how much it costs. But I want to hold that part back, and I don't want the fire department service. No, you're forced to pay for a fire department. In a libertarian system, the fire department wouldn't be a government organization. There would be probably private fire departments. And instead of being paid for by taxes, it would be an opt-in sort of thing. You could pay for a fire department subscription. What would happen is when there's a fire, let's say your house catches on fire, the fire department, before they rescue your building, before they put out the fire, they would check to make sure you were a subscriber. They would also check the neighbors on either side of your house to see if they are subscribers, because they might need to defend and protect those houses. They might show up, just in case, while they're like going through their data, and they're sitting there with their hoses, and the fire chief says, "Oh wait, they never subscribed. Go ahead and let the house burn down." If in that moment you begged and pleaded, you said, "Please, please put the fire out. I know I'm not a subscriber, but please have mercy. I'm going to lose everything." The fire department would have to say, "No, it's too late." That's how insurance works. If they let you sign up or subscribe at the last second, then nobody would subscribe until the last second. But then it would be too expensive to run a firefighting company. So this seems like a realistic situation that could arise in a pure libertarian world. In your handout, I think it's box 2, I ask you to consider this example of the fire department, the libertarian fire department. Do you think it's a good idea? Why or why not? I'm going to give you 2 minutes to jot down an answer to this. Okay, 1 minute. Okay, go ahead and finish your last thought, your last sentence. Let's come back together. I look forward to seeing what you wrote. I think the firefighter example, the fire department example, shows us that libertarianism comes with a cost. The cost is this. If you rank rights and protecting rights higher than welfare, the maximizing welfare of a society, you may end up with a less happy society overall, and certainly a less equal society overall. That's the cost. And again, if rights are fundamental, then it's worth it. But it's important to kind of feel that. So for example, if there's no paternalistic laws, you're going to be having probably a lot more people dying in motorcycle accidents or dying in car crashes. You're probably going to be having more people, well, it's possible you might have more people struggling with other types of harmful things like drug addictions. It's possible though. So you end up with more suffering. Also, if people want to make foolish financial choices and get into extreme debt and maybe end up extremely depressed and anxious for the rest of their life, you have to let people do that. You have to be willing to let people make bad choices. And again, think of moralistic choices. Maybe in the long run, prostitution actually makes society worse and unhappy. A utilitarian would say, well, in that case, get rid of prostitution. But a libertarian would say you have to let people make the choices they'll make, even if in the long run society is worse off. And maybe society would be happier in the long run if everybody was forced to pay for the fire department. But a libertarian would say, no, I'm willing to live in a sadder, less happy world in order to guarantee rights. Now, it could be the case. Like maybe you're arguing, maybe you want to argue with this right now. Remember, I'm the libertarian today, so you can argue with me, but it's not actually me, right? Maybe you want to argue and say, hey, if you defend rights and you maintain a minimal state, you protect rights, protect liberty, you will have a happier society in the long run. It's not an either or, Dr. Gormley. It's not an either or. You don't have to rank one over the other. Okay, that's a reasonable argument. I just want to point out that is technically, though, a utilitarian argument for rights, not a libertarian argument for rights. So if you're arguing with me and saying, hey, protect rights because in the long run, you actually also get a happier, healthier society, that's a utilitarian argument. Libertarians have to say this: even if protecting a right will make society much worse, it's hard to see that happening, but if that's the case, we still say rights are more important than maximizing welfare. I think it's important to tease this out because I think a lot of people think they're libertarians, like pure blood libertarians, and it turns out utilitarianism is such a powerful way of thinking, such a convincing way of thinking, that a lot of us have this like blend going on, right? We are partially influenced by libertarianism, partially influenced by utilitarianism. The bottom line is this: libertarians have to be willing to live in a worse world, a world with more pain and suffering. And that's a potential cost to ranking rights and freedom above maximizing welfare. The next thing I want to talk about is, for a libertarian, what makes a distribution of goods just? This is the next question in the handout. Now, what did that sentence even mean? What does it mean to have a distribution of goods? Goods are things like money and income and wealth and opportunity and power. They're these good things that help people flourish. These good things can be distributed in society in a variety of ways. So in some societies, all of the goods go right to the people with the most power. Maybe the king and the queen. The king and the queen have 95% of the goods, the wealth, the power, the opportunity, the income. And then the rest of the population has to fight over the tiny bit remaining. Actually, it turns out that's what America is like right now. I mean, we don't have kings and queens, but we do have billionaires and multimillionaires who control almost all of the wealth. So we're actually not far from a king and queen society, turns out. An alternative way to distribute goods would be to take everybody's wealth, income, money, power, and opportunity and redistribute it equally so that everybody has exactly the same. That is what we would call egalitarianism. And we're going to look at that next class period. Egalitarianism. So those are two possible distributions of goods. Which one is more just? A libertarian has a third option. For a libertarian, it's important that goods are not distributed in an arbitrary way. If all of the goods go to, let's say, the 1%, the top 1%, if all the goods are controlled by the 1%, whether it's kings and queens or whether it's billionaires, it seems like that's going to be arbitrary. I'll get to that in a second. Conversely, if you take everybody's money and distribute it equally, that also seems arbitrary. Those would be morally arbitrary distributions of goods. So how should goods be distributed? Well, for a libertarian, a fair distribution of goods would give people what they deserve. If they work hard and they are entitled, they are entitled to having more than the people who don't work hard. If hard workers don't get what they deserve, that's morally arbitrary. And conversely, if those lazy bums get everything for free, that also would not be fair. That would be morally arbitrary. So again, take the billionaire. If the billionaire got his billions of dollars just from inheriting it and not from actually working for it, that might be morally arbitrary. That isn't much different than a king or a queen. But if a billionaire gets that money through freaking hard, intense, relentless work, they're entitled to their billions. They deserved it. In the next box in your handout, box number 3, I want you to try to think about comparing a libertarian society to a feudal society. Remember a feudal society? That's the society, like, for example, in medieval Europe, with land-holding nobility and little serfs that worked the land. Which one is more morally arbitrary? And why? Go ahead and jot down an answer to that. Compare a libertarian society and a feudal society. Which one is more morally arbitrary, and why? Hopefully, it's clear to you that the feudal society is way more morally arbitrary. Well, at least that's what a libertarian would argue. So maybe you want to disagree with a libertarian, but that's what a libertarian would argue. In a feudal society, goods are distributed unfairly. A few people, the 1%, are arbitrarily born as nobles. Nobles don't choose to be born as nobles. They don't earn the class of nobility. They're just born that way. And as nobles, though, they get all the land and all the wealth and all the power. Everyone else, by no fault of their own, are born as serfs. They're landless peasants who have to work like slaves their whole lives. In a feudal society, the goods are distributed in a highly morally arbitrary way. And again, today, some of the wealthy of modern America have their wealth in just as morally arbitrarily of a way. And a libertarian would want to question that. Libertarianism, in contrast, don't think your status at birth should determine how wealthy you should be. Let me say that again. Libertarians, in contrast, don't think your status at birth should determine how wealthy you will be. Everyone should be free to become whatever they want to be. It shouldn't matter if you're born into a poor family, middle-class family, wealthy family. It should be the case that if you work hard, you should be able to become successful. Goods should be distributed according to merit, not social class. Does that make sense? Let's get to Robert Nozick's way of putting it. He provides further guidelines for what makes a distribution of goods to be just. He says, goods should be distributed by individuals making free choices in free markets. Goods should be distributed by individuals making free choices in free markets. But how do you know a market is free? How do you know a market is free? And now look at box number 4 on the back side of your handout. There are 2 criteria for determining when a market is free or when the distribution of goods is free. The first is this: justice in initial holding. Justice in initial holding. When you look at your original wealth, the wealth you're using to buy stuff in the market, how did you get that stuff? Did you get it freely? Then it would be just. Or did you get it through coercion, theft, or fraud? If you got it through coercion, theft, or fraud, then your initial holdings are not just. So incidentally, libertarians like Robert Nozick are theoretically okay with the concept of reparations, of paying reparations. Robert Nozick sees reparations as entirely compatible with libertarianism. Because, for example, if you got 10 acres of land by persecuting Native Americans, if you got that land because the army chased Native Americans off of their land, your initial holding would not be just, and the way you rectify that would be through reparations. Sometimes you come across a libertarian who doesn't believe in reparations, but it could be argued that reparations in some cases are necessary for the libertarian. And this would be an example of that. So number 1, how do you know if a market is free? There needs to be justice in initial holding. Number 2, there needs to be justice in the transfer. Justice in the transfer. So again, when you are selling something, when you sell it to someone, are you using coercion, theft, or fraud? Or if when you're buying it, are you coercing someone or stealing it or getting it by fraud? If so, then it's not a just transaction. So for a distribution of goods to be free, Nozick would say, to be just, sorry, it needs to be made by individuals making free choices in a free market. And how do you know it's a free market and individuals making free choices? Well, one, justice in initial holdings and justice in transfer. Let's try out Novick's theory. Let's try it out. I'm going to try it. I'm going to be vulnerable. I'm going to throw myself under the bus here. I bought a house. I'm very privileged to be able to buy a house. I bought a house 11 years ago. I had to pay a down payment. I needed something like $10,000. Where did I get that $10,000? Well, I inherited it from my grandfather. Okay. Is my buying of a house just? Is my buying of a house just? How would Professor Novick interrogate me? That's the question I have for you. I think it is box 5. What questions would Novick ask Dr. Gormley to determine if his ownership of his house was just? I've told you just a little bit. I inherited $10,000 for the down payment. I got that from my grandfather. Go ahead and write down some questions. What questions would Novick ask me? I'll give you part of the 2 minutes. Okay, go ahead and pair up with the person next to you. Like, see what you asked each other. I mean, see the questions you think Novick would ask. Go ahead and pair up and share your answers with each other. I'm going to give you 2 minutes. If you've been hogging the conversation, it's time to let your neighbor, your partner, put some 2 cents in. 1 minute left. All right, go ahead and finish up your thought. Let's come back together. Now, I really like doing this in person, so I'm sorry I'm not here to, you guys, usually when I do this live, people ask me questions and we're able to kind of figure out together whether or not my buying a house is just or not. A question that people often ask is, what did your grandfather do for a living? And I say, he was a salesman. Did he sell legal things or illegal things? Oh, he sold legal things. How come he made so much money? Well, actually, he did make a lot of money and then he lost it all because he was an alcoholic. God bless him. He's died. So then maybe they ask, well, where did the money come from then? And then I say something like this. Well, back in the 1950s, he bought a house in Los Angeles for about $35,000. Okay, wait for it. Over the next 50 years, his house appreciated, right? That means the value of the house rose. It appreciated by not 50%, not 100%, but 10,000%. He bought it for $35,000 in 1950 something, and it got sold in the mid 2000s for $3.5 million. $3.5 million. Now, I wish the story went like this, and I became a millionaire because I inherited a ton of money. Well, unfortunately, alcoholism meant that a lot of that money had to go to pay off all kinds of debts and all kinds of legal problems. Most of the money was blown. So I wish I had a really exciting story, and I wish I could invite you all to visit my mansion. The house I bought, by the way, was about 1,000 square feet. So it's not like it's a mansion. But so then the next question is this. So Robert Novick Zick, sorry, I always say his name wrong. Nozick. Is it just then? I inherited this money, from my grandfather? Well, there's one more complication. The complication is this. How did my grandfather originally get that land for $35,000? Well, one reason why the cost of the land appreciated so much was because of the government. The government, through various interventions into the market, allowed houses to be bought at ridiculously low costs. The initial purchasing of the house wasn't on a free market, in other words. And this is true across America. People who bought houses in the 30s, 40s, 50s, a little bit into the 60s, weren't buying free market houses because actually most people couldn't afford free market houses. They were buying basically government-backed houses, which allowed them to suddenly become affordable. And all those lucky ducks, like my grandfather and their grandchildren, there's my raised hand, their grandchildren who benefited from it, acquired enormous amount of wealth, but not necessarily through a libertarian free market. I said there was one more complication. Here's a second one. The land on which my grandfather's house was built, it could be argued, was unjustly acquired. It was land that belonged to the Tongva Native Americans. The Tongva Native Americans lived there for hundreds of years. And when the government came along, they basically stole the land and denied the Tongva a reservation. They still, to this day, the Tongva people are not recognized as a First Nation. And one reason, again, that my grandfather was able to buy a house so cheaply was because the land was free. And by free, we mean stolen. So it turns out, I think Robert Nozick, I did it again. Okay, aside. I had a professor named Nozick. Novik, never mind. And so every time I think of this Nozick, I say his name wrong. My whole life I've gotten V's and Z's mixed up in my brain. It's like a tiny dyslexia. Okay, anyways. So it turns out Robert Nozick would say to me, your buying a house is tainted. It's tainted. It's not a totally free, just action. And in fact, you might try to figure out some way to pay reparations for it. And that would be a whole nother conversation. But if I was a true libertarian, I'd have to admit that's the case. Okay. That's libertarianism. I look forward to hearing your evaluation of it. And in your homework, you wrote, what do you find compelling about it? What do you find problematic, or what questions does it arise? And I look forward to reading that. The last thing I want to do with you, question number 5, is what are a few weaknesses of libertarianism? There's aspects of libertarianism I really, really like. Okay, I'll just be honest with you. But I'm also aware of various weaknesses, and I think so I want to bring them up so you're aware of them too. There's many I could talk to you about today, but I'm going to mention just 3. Here they are. I'll list them and then I'll describe them after I list them. Number 1, it's actually very hard to prove self-ownership. How would you prove self-ownership? Jeremy Bentham would say it's not real. It might be another leap of faith. It might require a leap of faith, I should say, kind of like the belief in God perhaps requires a leap of faith. It becomes particularly hard to prove self-ownership when we consider the obligations we have to family members in society. And we're going to spend a whole class period on this topic, but I thought I'd flag it now. It becomes hard to prove self-ownership, especially when we consider our obligations to family members in society. That's number 1. Number 2, it's very difficult to determine when we're truly acting freely and when we're actually being coerced. It's very difficult to determine when we are acting freely and when we're being coerced. That's the second weakness. The third weakness is this. Justice means doing the right thing. How do you know what the right thing to do is? That's another way of asking the question, what's the just thing to do? What the just thing to do is the right thing to do. So justice and morality are actually linked. But here's the problem. Sorry. Number 3, it's unclear that liberty and morality have anything to do with each other. It's unclear that liberty and morality have anything to do with each other. We'll get to this problem in a minute. So number 1, it's hard to prove self-ownership. 2, it's hard to determine when we're acting freely and when we're being coerced. And 3, it's unclear that liberty and morality have anything to do with each other. Let's take these one at a time. How would you prove self-ownership? Are you sure you own yourself? Or is it the case that other people or other communities own a part of you? Consider, for example, your family. Does your family own at least a part of you? How about your children? Do you have obligations to children that show your children own a part of you? Or society as a whole? Or what about God? If you're a believer in God, does God own at least a part of you? Let's consider the example of consensual cannibalism. This is on page 73 and 74 of Sandel's book. 73 and 74. Consensual cannibalism. It goes like this. In 2001, a strange encounter took place in the German village of Rottenburg. Brand Jürgen Brandes, a 43-year-old software engineer, responded to an internet ad seeking someone willing to be killed and eaten. The ad had been posted by Armin Maiwes, 42, a computer technician. Maiwes was offering no monetary compensation, only the experience itself. Some 200 people replied to the ad, which is kind of shocking. 4 traveled to Maiwes' farmhouse for an interview, but decided they were not interested. But when Brandes met with Maiwes and considered his proposal over coffee, he gave his consent. Maiwes proceeded to kill his guests, carve up the corpse, and store it in plastic bags in his freezer. By the time he was arrested, the, quote, cannibal of Rottenburg had consumed over 40 pounds of his willing victim, cooking some of him in olive oil and garlic. When Maiwes was brought to trial, the lurid case fascinated the public and confounded the court. Germany has no law against cannibalism. The perpetrator could not be convicted of murder, the defense maintained, because the victim was a willing participant in his own death. If libertarianism is true, and if we own ourselves, it could be argued that you have the right to consensually give yourself over to be eaten by another human being. Because you own yourself. No one else owns yourself. You own your body. No one else owns your body. Now, let me play with this story just a little bit. Brand Jürgen Brandes. What if he left behind a wife and 4 children under the age of 12, let's say? And let's suppose he has parents that are getting old, and he was their only child, and they needed him to take care of them in their old age after a lifetime of them taking care of him. Suppose he has a dear, dear cousin who was his best friend his whole life. certainly the members of his immediate family and his extended family would suffer greatly through his choice. His children and his wife would suffer economically. They'd suffer materially. But way beyond that, all of them would suffer emotionally and psychologically. And doesn't this extreme suffering demonstrate the limits of self-ownership? Doesn't this extreme suffering inflicted on his family show that his family should have had some say in his choice? In other words, he doesn't completely own himself, but is in some ways owned or under obligation to his family, to his children, to his wife, to his parents. It seems that the argument for self-ownership becomes difficult to maintain when you start considering how our actions affect the people around us. Let me give you a quiz question. I'm going to quiz you. Ready? How would Catholic social teaching respond to the claim of self-ownership, or the belief in self-ownership? How would Catholic social teaching respond to the belief in self-ownership? Try to answer that question in your notes. I'll give you a little bit of time. How would Catholic social teaching respond to the belief in self-ownership? What I'm doing here is I'm asking you to apply a concept from a few class sessions ago. Because if you're able to apply concepts, that shows that you're comprehending them at a higher level. Catholic social teaching would challenge the idea of self-ownership, just like they challenge the conception of individualism, of liberalism in general. Remember, Catholic social teaching argues for the social nature of the self. In other words, the self, the individual, is not an island. The individual is not autonomous. The individual is social. The individual finds its meaning and fulfillment in multiple levels of community to which he or she belongs, like family, clan, tribe, and neighborhood. And the individual has responsibilities or obligations to each of these communities. So the challenge of that Catholic social teaching brings to liberalism in general would apply to libertarianism in particular. It would challenge the idea of self-ownership and say, no, you actually belong to a whole bunch of communities. By nature you belong to these. These are natural, you're naturally a social person. And in each of these worlds, each of these communities, you have obligations. I love this tension here. It's a challenge to me. I frequently meet people who claim to be both libertarian and Christian at the same time. And the more I learn about Christianity, the more I learn about libertarianism, the more surprising this hybrid position seems, because it seems to me more and more that the more I learn that these viewpoints are in many ways incompatible. And so I have a question for myself as a Christian attracted to libertarianism. And it's a question I have for you if that's you, if you see yourself as a Christian libertarian. Here's the question. And this is a sincere question. It's not a trap question. What is the difference between self-ownership and being owned by God? What's the difference between self-ownership, I own myself, no one else owns me, and ownership by God? Think back to the story of the Exodus. God rescues the slave class of Egypt. And when he does so, that slave class that becomes Israel is now obligated to God. God claims them as his personal possession. You could say that God from then on owns them. And when you join up with that, or Jesus' version of that called the kingdom of God, you perhaps give up self-ownership and now you belong to God. So it could be argued. And so what's the difference between self-ownership and being owned by God? And what I mean by that, what's the difference? I mean, what practical difference does it make in how you live your life? That's the first weakness of libertarianism. It's hard to prove self-ownership. Now, I guess if you're a Christian, it's hard to maintain it in light of Christian teaching. Okay, that's the first weakness. The second one is this. It's difficult to determine when someone is acting freely. How do you know when you're acting freely and when you're actually being coerced by an internal or external pressure? How do you know? There's so many examples in life when people claim to be acting freely, but everyone else can see that they're actually being coerced by something external or something internal. Take a horrific example that happens over and over again. Take the example of a high school student who falls in love with their high school teacher and ends up sleeping with them. Right? Imagine a 14-year-old high school boy who sleeps with his manipulative high school teacher. He feels awesome. He's like, man, I'm so cool. But the rest of society looks at that and goes, that teacher's coercing him. That teacher is using their power to coerce him. He's actually not making a free choice. He thinks he's making a free choice, but he's not. Or think about the power of addiction. Right? There's a big debate about whether or not addicts are making free choices. But let's consider the process through which one becomes addicted. Let's imagine a person who's not yet addicted to something, but very well maybe is becoming addicted. Are they making free choices along the way to addiction? At some point, is the addiction taking over and controlling the free choice? Some would say that free choices cannot be made unless several factors are in place. Take, for example, the free market, the market that Robert Nozick believes in. A free market, for a market to be free, there requires several things to be in place. First, buyers and sellers have to have equal power. Buyers and sellers have to have equal power so that no one's coercing the other. Such coercion happens when a company gets a monopoly, for example. A libertarian would support, in some occasions, the government breaking up a monopoly, because in a monopoly, the seller has too much power over the buyer. Think of the price gouging that happened after Hurricane Katrina. If the seller and the buyer don't have equal or somewhat equal power, one or the other is going to be coerced by their circumstances, and that's not free. So not only do buyers and sellers need to have equal standing, equal footing, but for a market to be free, number two, buyers and sellers need to have what's called perfect information. They need to have perfect information. They need to know actually what are they buying, what are they selling. Think of the example Sandel raised in the book of Mary Beth Whitehead. She's the one who got pregnant and agreed to give her baby to the Stern family for $10,000. Miss Whitehead thought she was making a free choice, and the first judge said, yeah, she gave her consent. But she didn't have perfect information. In other words, she did not know what it would feel like. She didn't know what the maternal bond to the baby would be like after 9 months of pregnancy and after the baby was born. And the second court said, no, that wasn't a free choice. It was tainted because she didn't have the right kind of knowledge or the right kind of experience. So again, the big question, or the big weakness is, how do you know when you're really making a free choice as opposed to being coerced? And it could be an unconscious coercion. Sandel speaks about tainted consent, and many kinds of things can taint our consent. We think we're making a free choice, but here they are. Things that taint our consent: lack of experience, lack of knowledge, lack of opportunities or options so that we're being desperate, unequal power. Right? Have you ever agreed to do something because someone's persuading you? At the time, you think it's just persuasion, but in hindsight, you realize it was manipulation. Right? Have you ever ended up, you realize, oh crap, I was just manipulated, right? So you got lack of experience, lack of knowledge, lack of opportunities or options, unequal power. All of these things taint our consent, in which case we're really not making a free choice. We're being manipulated consciously or unconsciously. And these things happen all the time. In summary, it becomes very difficult in many situations to determine when someone is acting freely. And that's a weakness of libertarianism. It's a weakness of the free market. Finally, the last weakness of libertarianism is it is unclear that freedom and morality have anything to do with each other. Number one, this is kind of a subpoint, there are many kinds of situations, or there frequently are situations, when doing the right thing, the moral thing, the just thing, doesn't depend upon freedom. Let me give you a scenario. Imagine a grown son who verbally abuses his mother because he's angry at her. She's very old. She doesn't understand everything. She keeps making mistakes, and he loses his temper, and he chews her out, verbally abusing her, calling her awful names. The mother falls apart and starts weeping. When the son's wife finds out, she's like, "What the heck did you do to her? You go and apologize." And he says, "Heck no. I'm not going to apologize to her. And the wife is like, you better go and apologize. And if you don't, you're sleeping on the couch for the next month. And now the son, he thinks it over and he's still pissed off. But against his will, he goes and apologizes anyways. And he says to his mom, I'm sorry I said those hurtful things to you, even though he doesn't mean it. Well, the mom feels comforted and stops weeping. You could argue that his actions weren't actually free because he was being coerced by his wife. And yet he did the right thing. He ended the suffering of his elderly mother. And I think there are many other examples where you do the right thing and it doesn't really matter whether you're coerced or not. So again, there are situations when doing the right thing, the moral thing, doesn't depend on freedom. You could think of well, I'm going to stop there. Conversely, all because we're acting freely doesn't mean what we're doing is moral. All because we're acting freely, giving our consent, not harming anyone else, doesn't mean what we're doing is moral. Consider the phenomenon of regret. And by regret, I mean when we do something freely and we don't like the results. We know very well what the results are going to be. It's our fault. It's no one else's fault. And we regret it. I don't mean regret when you regret something done to you and it's not your fault. I'm talking about the phenomenon of regret when it is your fault. So for example, imagine a woman who on a Friday night hooks up with a guy at a bar and they spend the night together. And suppose that it was a totally free choice. It was consensual. Well, the next day, the woman feels tremendous regret. She wishes she hadn't made the choice that she had made the night before. Her sense of regret suggests her choice, even though made freely, is not good. So, this is subpoint 2. Not only are there times when doing the right thing is the right thing, even when it's not done freely, right? That's the first example. Here we see an example of a free choice, not guaranteeing that what we're doing is moral. So it looks like there are many cases when freedom and morality have nothing to do with each other. How would a libertarian respond? Well, libertarianism and liberalism in general tries to stay out of morality. It tries to be, quote, morally neutral. Let people decide for themselves what good to pursue. Don't tell people what to do. Right? Remember that libertarians want the law and the government to never impose moralistic legislation. Yet, in the end, it's not clear that libertarianism is actually neutral. It tells people what to do. Here's the commandment. Thou shalt not infringe upon another person's freedom. It does have a morality, but it's a morality just about freedom. But it turns out morality based solely on freedom is kind of thin. And it's difficult to defend because in many cases, morality and freedom don't seem to have anything to do with each other. So those are three limitations of libertarianism I just want to flag. One, it's hard to prove self-ownership. Two, it's hard to know when you're actually free, making a free choice. And three, there's many cases when morality and freedom don't seem really to go together at all. We've reached the end of the topics I want to cover. I want to give you finally 2 minutes in the last box of your handout. Oh, wait, yeah, in the last box of your handout, box number 7. What do you want to remember from today? Again, the reason why I want you to do this is research shows that when you go through this little exercise, it helps you remember, helps you comprehend stuff later. So 2 minutes. Timer's already started. What do you want to remember from today? One more minute. All right. You're welcome to add to this later. But let me just wrap up by saying sometime in the next 30 minutes or the next hour, as soon as possible, go back to those questions that I had for you about libertarianism, the 5 questions, and try to answer them on a fresh sheet of paper from memory. Then, if you can't do that, consult your notes. And then if you can't do that, consult a classmate. And then if you can't do that, consult me. Go through this process every class session. The sooner you do this, the better your comprehension will be. You'll take stuff that was about to be deleted from your temporary memory and you'll put it into your long-term memory. And then you also will recognize, oh wait, I thought I understood question 3 and now I realize I don't. The sooner you can identify the places where you have questions, the better. Finally, a reminder, before class 7, make sure you read chapters 5 and 6 of Sandel. And we're going to be talking about egalitarianism as another theory of justice. And make sure by August 25th, this coming Tuesday afternoon, you turn in your day 5 and 6 homeworks and your day 5 and 6 handouts. Make sure you get that practicum step 2 turned into me, all right? And I look forward to hearing from you. Please email me with any questions or use the end of handout number 6 to give me questions and feedback. And have a wonderful rest of your day, rest of your week. Blessings.